Hey pushers, Dr. Killo here. I wanted to leave you guys this year with, I think, an important lesson about civil rights. Obviously, it's a current issue right now, and it's very important, I think, for you guys to have some understanding of what's going on and how we got here. Because what's going on right now is not an isolated incident. It's something that's a part of our history, and I just want to make sure you guys understand what's going on. So this is a kind of a long year pod. There's a lot of stuff added to it. It's something you're not going to be able to do in one shot. I would encourage you to watch everything that's on here, read everything that's on here. Um, it'll give you quite an understanding of what's going on and how we got to where we are right now. So let's get started. I started off here. I listed this article about the massacres that took place around the 1920s. It's 100 years ago. And after World War II, there was a lot of massacres that occurred in the United States. The biggest one is been in the news a lot lately, the Tulsa massacre. But if you look at this article, down the bottom, it's got a lot of other massacres that took place in the United States at that time period. So it kind of leads you into the civil rights movement, so you kind of see what was going on prior to the civil rights movement and what African American lives were like back in the early 20th century. All right, so I started off here also with a clip of Mitch McConnell, who a couple years ago said that in reference to reparations, which is an issue I don't really want to get into, but he's basically said that nobody alive today is responsible for slavery, and nobody is affected by slavery. And I just want you to take a look at this because I think after you've watched this Nearpod, you might have a different take on that. Yeah, slavery's gone, no doubt, but the racism that was part of American slavery is still very much real and still very much affects the lives of people in this country. So take a look at what Mitch has to say. All right, so again, background here a little bit is, we had Jim Crow laws after slavery that basically prevented African Americans from being able to live their lives freely. There were rules on segregation and social customs and voting and things like that, and these laws were aimed at preventing blacks from exercising their rights. So you guys are pretty familiar with that, I would imagine. Okay, so it did, when did change start? Change starts, you could argue in the 1930s with FDR beginning to talk civil rights with African Americans. Truman really is the one that really kicks it off, though. We talked before about how he made it a campaign issue in 1948, how he desegregated the military in 1947. He's the one who really kind of gets things started. Also, part of what got him motivated in doing that is right after World War II, when vets came home, African American vets were murdered in the summer of 1946, and that upset him. Also, you get in 1955 Emmett Till. I'm going to have a video here. It's a half-hour long video, or maybe an hour-long video, of the story of Emmett Till. Heart-crushing story about a young 14-year-old kid who went to visit his uncle in Mississippi and was lynched for supposedly whistling at a white woman. Although we just recently heard from that white woman in the last couple of years admitting that that never happened. So this kid was lynched because she lied about a black boy whistling at her in her store in Mississippi. Tragic. Okay, it's after World War II, you get African Americans like Paul Robeson going around and talking about the experience of Jim Crow, which kind of brings to mind Frederick Douglass, in the 1830s and 40s, going around talking, or 40s and 50s, talking about the experience of slavery. Here we are, 100 years later, and African Americans are doing the same thing. They have to educate white people in America about what their lives are really like. Paul Robeson, by the way, great writer. Also, if you get a chance to read some of this stuff. Okay, so changes start to occur after World War II. As I said, we desegregate the military. Jackie Robinson ends up breaking the color barrier, which is it's kind of trivial, but it's not. I mean, baseball was America's pastime. And again, if you get the chance to watch the movie 42, it's a decent movie to kind of show you what it was like. And if you're from Philadelphia, it's very, very embarrassing because Philadelphia played not such a nice role in Jackie Robinson's breakout, season as the first integrated player in baseball. It was just shameful what we did. Anyway, also, the NAACP starts to advocate more in the courts. They've been doing that since 1906, but they begin to advocate more to try to get change in America through the legal system and see if we could do it peacefully. Here's that video on Emmett Till. Again, I encourage you to watch it. It is tragic. Okay, Rosa Parks is what most Americans are familiar with the beginning of the civil rights movement. Um, she basically refuses to give up her seat in a segregated bus in Alabama, and it leads to a year-long boycott of the buses. It's the beginning of Martin Luther King's role as the leader of the civil rights movement in the South. Um, Very effective, works very well. Here's a picture of the Little Rock Nine. This poor young lady did not get the call that morning that the other African American kids were going to go into school as a group in a car. She walked to school on her own, and she had her own little escort of racist people who were just dogging her the whole way. Um, and she eventually ends up surrounded by the mob, and a white woman came to her rescue and escorted her out of there and put her on a bus to get her out of there so she wouldn't get hurt. Here is a National Guardsman doing his best imitation of a lawn ornament, doing absolutely nothing to protect this young woman, just standing by as she is just tormented by these folks who were trailing after her. It's just horrible. Um, okay, again, so we begin beginnings of civil rights with Truman again. I talked about that. Eisenhower, again, he just sat back and did nothing this whole time for the most part. Let's enjoy the economic benefits that we have going on. Why trouble people with rocking the boats and anything like that? Just awful. Earl Warren is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's the guy that really starts to shake things up. He hears the case Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in which he overthrows Plessy versus Ferguson and institutes the beginnings of something called separate but equal, where he says you cannot have separate facilities and consider them to be equal. That's what Plessy versus Ferguson said. He said that's not possible. So you have to have integrated things. And he basically orders the integration of public schools all over America with all deliberate speed, which means basically nothing. So the South took that to mean, okay, we don't have to do this. And so places resisted the efforts to integrate schools. Like I said, Little Rock Nine in Arkansas was a place where the governor tried to prevent African American kids from going to the white high school in the town. It took the active military to be sent in by Eisenhower. Again, Eisenhower didn't do it because he believed in integration. He did it because the governor of Arkansas was challenging the federal government, and Eisenhower was not going to let that happen. But as far as his feelings about civil rights, that wasn't something he was really all that concerned with. So you begin to see in Virginia, they actually closed down public schools for an entire year rather than integrate. And all kids, white kids who could afford to go to private school, went to private school, and everybody else just didn't go to school. So that was their answer to integration in Virginia, a border state, by the way. Horrible. All right. Anyway, so again, Eisenhower, again, this kind of infuriates me. His personal attitudes helped restrain him, it says. Felt court's rulings upset customs and convictions of at least 2 generations of America. Wah, freaking wah. How sad is that Americans would have to get used to the idea that African Americans should be treated equally to whites. But he didn't want to upset their customs and convictions, so he did as little as possible to actually promote civil rights during his administration. Again, he just wanted to sit back and enjoy the fruits of America's economic boom and do nothing to help anybody else. It's kind of very sad. This is an interview with some Little Rock Nine kids. It's kind of interesting. Get a chance to watch that. Wild year for those kids. So we begin to have Civil Rights Act passed. In this case, it's simply just a board to kind of oversee civil rights in America. We have the beginnings of these organizations like SCLC and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is trying to promote civil rights in the South. Sit-in movement. This is when things really kind of kick in and it gets to be, the height of the civil rights movement. So sit-ins are basically where college kids decided they were going to go to these segregated lunch counters in these drugstores in the South and integrate them. They were just going to sit down at the counter where they were not allowed to normally sit and try to get served. And they got the crud kicked out of them by local whites. But eventually it worked. What the civil rights movement discovered was you had to hit white America in their pocketbooks. If these stores are going to segregate, you had to basically punish the store economically to get them to end their practices. So they sat down at lunch counters, basically closing the store because they refused to get served. the place became, violent, and the stores got closed down. So, it took economic motivation to get people to actually acknowledge the ills and the wrongs of segregation in a lot of these places. So again, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was led by a guy named John Lewis, who is a congressman from Georgia and is still alive today. If you ever get a chance to see him, please do so. He is one of President Trump's frequent people he attacks in Congress. Here's a video of what it was like being a sit-in person, how these kids, again, nonviolent, they got the crud beat out of them, and they never retaliated. The whole point of doing this was to get the press to cover them and to see them as the victims. If the white kids if the black kids would have punched back, the story would have been, unruly black kids caused riot in a store, rather than the fact that these black kids got the crud beat out of them by white kids. JFK, again, not a huge supporter of civil rights, but he also wanted to, benefit from the black vote. So he kind of made some ties with Martin Luther King. Although I wouldn't say he was like all in with him, but he was trying to help a little bit. Freedom Riders. These are folks who try to integrate buses and bus stations in the South for interstate commerce. Again, great movies about that. If you get a chance to watch Selma, or The Butler, kind of shows you movies about that where these folks in these buses were firebombed, beaten. It was just awful, and the state police usually stood back and watched the Klan do it to them. Here's an example of one of the buses being firebombed. It's a horrible moment in American history. Again, King is he's the leader of the movement, and JFK doesn't really want to be that tight to him because some of King's closest people are also suspected communists. Not that that really should matter too much in this case, but hey, it's the Cold War, and we have this anti-communist feeling in America that scares us. So that's one of the reasons why he was distanced. The FBI wiretapped King and harassed him, to try to get him to stop what he was doing. Okay, so the integration of Ole Miss, University of Mississippi in Mississippi was a big issue in October '62. James Meredith was the one who integrated it, but one of the most important stories to come out of that for me was Medgar Evers, the assassination of the local NAACP leader. He was shot in his front yard, right in front of his wife and kids by an assassin, and I'm going to play a song here in a little bit. You'll get to see about that. You got the Birmingham one. This is where the whole world basically watched, just like the whole world is watching us right now over George Floyd. They watched basically police use fire hoses and billy clubs and dogs on people, which again, our president just called on law enforcement to use dogs again. So this kind of got international attention and was a big deal. So again, here's a song by Bob Dylan. I encourage you to listen to it and listen to what he's saying, because he doesn't necessarily blame the assassin for a killing of Medgar Evers. It's the system that's the problem, and I would kind of agree with that. Again, we're going to skip over this. People saw on TV what was going on in Birmingham, and that horrified whites, and that's really what kind of got whites on the side of what was going on. Again, more video of what's going on in Birmingham with the dogs attacking peaceful, nonviolent demonstrators. So finally in '63, King calls for a march on Washington to promote the idea of a civil rights bill to end discrimination in America. Kennedy tried to stop him from doing it, tried to tell him not to. King went ahead with it anyway, and the rest is history. This is what we call the I Have a Dream speech that you're familiar with. I have that on here as well for you guys to listen to. It's only about 20 minutes long. I do want you to notice that most of the beginning of the speech, although it's a good metaphor on the idea of a blank check that America has written in the area of civil rights, in the end, what people remember about this speech is I've been to the mountaintop and I have a dream. That part, if you'll notice, he's not reading from a speech anymore. That's off the top of his head. And that's when he speaks the best, I think, is when he's doing things off the top of his head. But anyway, good chance to watch that. So Kennedy is assassinated, so the Civil Rights Bill kind of dies, but does it? One of the neat things about Kennedy's assassination is Johnson ends up using it as a reason for Congress to pass Civil Rights Act. Do it for Kennedy. He used sympathy for Kennedy's assassination to get the Civil Rights Bill passed, and that was effective. And good job, Lyndon Johnson. So that kind of takes us for the first half of the civil rights movement Now we're going to stop and do the second half. See you.